TV. I'm Jay Sanin. Thank you so much for tuning in on Tuesday night, whenever you're tuning in on demand. We got a lot to get to tonight. We're going to look back at week 5 in the NFL, talk about the key takeaways in a segment we have creatively named What Have We Learned? We'll also look back at my picks for the week upon further review. A 2-3 week, not terrible, but could have been a lot better as well. We'll talk about that in more detail in just a little bit. Also, want to talk about the relationship between the NFL and COVID-19 tonight. Of course, some games being rescheduled. One of them, if you're watching live, happens to be happening right now between the Titans and the Bills. We'll get you all caught up on everything you need to know, at least in the short term, as far as reschedules. And we'll talk a little bit about how you might want to approach some of those games as a bettor. And of course, at the end of the show, we'll get you our Week 6 early action, one pick that you need to get in early before Thursday's show. We'll get to all that right here coming up on the GBI show. Of course, the tonight's show brought to you as always by BetQL. Use BetQL for all your NFL betting data. Over 10,000 simulations for each individual NFL game. They have projections to let you know where they see the game falling in terms of a final score. You can apply that to the spread and total, find value in those markets at BetQL. Use promo code SANIN at the bottom of your screen for 20% off all subscriptions. Now, let's get right to it. We'll start with a segment where we talk about what we learned from the week before in the NFL, a segment that I have so creatively named, What Have We Learned? And the first thing we learned in week 5 of the NFL season is that the Dallas Cowboys, ladies and gentlemen, might be in some real trouble the rest of this year. Of course, they beat the Giants. That's not the story, though. The story with the Cowboys, Dak Prescott, done for the year after a gruesome injury to that leg, to the ankle. I mean, just brutal as soon as you saw it. And of course, CBS with all the replays, and they show him in the tunnel. Really gratuitous with the camera work there. And an injury that you didn't want to see once, let alone a whole bunch of times. But from a betting perspective, more importantly, and of course you hope Dak gets healthy, that's the most important thing. But from a bettor's perspective, what does this mean for the Dallas Cowboys? Well, the first thing it means, Andy Dalton taking over as the starting quarterback in the interim for Dallas. Now, Andy Dalton, arguably the best backup in the league. He spent a ton of time starting in Cincinnati. He's built a reputation as a decent quarterback, not a great quarterback, but a guy who has been serviceable, who has taken teams to the playoffs before. That's important. However, also worth considering is the fact that the Dallas Cowboys might have the worst defense in the NFL so far this season. At least they're in the conversation with the Jacksonville Jaguars for that dubious distinction. What does that mean? Well, Andy Dalton might be a decent relief pitcher, backup quarterback, but you can't afford a drop-off on offense whatsoever when you're dealing with the type of defensive ineptitude you're seeing in Dallas right now. I mean, they got lit up by Daniel Jones, who we've seen time and time again is not a good quarterback. They've been lit up by the inconsistent Baker Mayfield, by an Atlanta team that is so bad that they just fired their head coach. They have been lit up time and time again defensively. So yes, Andy Dalton, a serviceable backup quarterback, but you're going to need more than serviceable to keep up with the lack of production on the defensive side of the ball from this Dallas Cowboys team. Dak Prescott, he was in the middle of an MVP caliber campaign before that injury. And of course, there's all the stuff with his contract situation. Dallas Cowboys didn't want to get a deal done. And now, of course, that leaves Dak hanging high and dry, but it also leaves the Cowboys in a position where they, in the future, now have to figure out, are we going to pay a guy who just got injured? Are we going to, cut his rate down in the future? What are we going to do there? A lot of question marks at the quarterback position going forward for Dallas. But again, from a sports betting standpoint, Andy Dalton, he'll be decent. I think he'll be better than a lot of people think. And I think that you'll see some early overreaction in the market, such as the Cowboys being an underdog to the Arizona Cardinals right off the bat on Monday Night Football this week. But in the long term, are you going to be able to rely on the Cowboys when, again, slight downgrade in quarterback, but a substantial loss in terms of how that team can keep up with teams scoring a ton of points on them? Because that does not look like it's going to change anytime soon. And of course, Also, from a sports bettor's perspective, how is this going to affect the Cowboys' production as it relates to totals each week? Because the first few weeks of the season, the Cowboys over has been the best play in all of sports betting, not just in the NFL. You've seen time and time again them ringing that over, whether it be on the road against Seattle. I think the one time they didn't hit it was the first week of the season on the road against the LA Rams, who might have a good defense. They're a little inconsistent, but overall have played well defensively so far this season, have arguably the best player at any position in the league in Aaron Donald. Outside of that one game, outside of that one mismatch, Cowboys overs have been automatic. So how is Andy Dalton going to affect that? I think we'll see some serious total movement, at least for these first couple of weeks, and we'll see if the Cowboys can continue to meet those totals as we go along. Now, we hit briefly on Dan Quinn, and he ties into the second thing we learned here in week 5 of this NFL season, that being teams are not going to wait till the end of the season to fire coaches anymore. That is not how this is going down in 2020. We've already seen in the first 5 weeks of the season, 2 head coaches now lose their jobs. We saw Bill O'Brien fired after week 4 after the team got off to an 0-4 start. And now we've seen in Atlanta, Dan Quinn fired after the Falcons got off to an 0-5 start. You can argue, and I don't disagree with it one bit, that this was long overdue in Atlanta. You saw this team, they blow the huge lead in the Super Bowl a few years back, and they have never been the same since. You can argue it has a lot to do with Kyle Shanahan leaving his post as offensive coordinator and going to coach the San Francisco 49ers. There's plenty of validity to that. Whatever the reason, it was long overdue. That's absolutely a fact. Dan Quinn and GM Thomas Dimitroff no longer in the equation there in Atlanta. Now, we saw a bump for the Houston Texans in their first week without Bill O'Brien. They played very well at home this past week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, scored a double-digit victory. We don't know yet if that's because of the kind of emotional lift of getting rid of a lame duck coach, or if it's because they just happen to play the worst defense in the NFL. Only time will tell there. But when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons, you have to wonder, will the same situation be in play? Or with Raheem Morris taking over as the interim head coach, are they going to struggle in the short term? And, really it's anybody's guess at this point, because yes, I think there is some validity to the emotional lift factor of getting rid of a coach in a front office where things are clearly not working out. But at the same time, you're still a team that went out and lost its first 5 games. This doesn't automatically make you a quality football team. So we'll see if the Falcons can experience at least some short-term success the way that the Houston Texans did as soon as they got rid of Bill O'Brien. Elsewhere, we learned in week 5 that the Kansas City Chiefs, they're human. Who knew? After winning the Super Bowl, the Kansas City Chiefs reeled off 4 straight wins to start this regular season. They did get through one very close game, an overtime affair against Justin Herbert and the Los Angeles Chargers. But overall, things were going great. They were rolling, and they were a double-figure favorite against the Las Vegas Raiders in week 5. It didn't go so well for them. They gave up 40 points. They served up a hot, fresh 40 burger to the Las Vegas Raiders. I apologize. And they lost that game 40-32. And what was concerning about that game was deep into the second half, Patrick Mahomes had only attempted 4 passes. And what that tells you is the Chiefs' defense was not getting the Raiders off the field efficiently enough. They were having some long drives where the Raiders really dominating the time of possession, especially in that second half. And you saw it at the end of the game when they needed a stop down by 8. Mahomes just goes on a long drive, gets them from 16 to within 8. They get the 2-point conversion. A couple minutes left to go. They can't stop the run well enough to get off the field and get that ball back in the hands of Patrick Mahomes with a chance to tie the game. Is it concerning in the long run? Possibly. I wouldn't worry about it in the short term because, again, not every team is going to serve up a 40 burger, which is basically what it takes to beat Mahomes and the Chiefs. But when it comes to laying big numbers, it might be something you want to keep in mind when it comes to this Kansas City Chiefs team. They might struggle against some squads to get stops. We saw multiple levels of the defense get torched We saw Henry Ruggs have a big game for the Raiders. Almost just said Oakland Raiders. Stop myself. And of course, we saw Josh Jacobs bringing some yardage in key spots for the Raiders as well. So something to keep an eye on there, especially if you're somebody who thinks, the Chiefs are the best team in the league. You might want to hold off and maybe see if you can get some better prices in the futures market on them if you think they're the best team, and maybe lay off on laying some of the bigger numbers until they get some of their defensive issues figured out. And of course, we'll talk about the COVID-19 situation that might have been affecting them in the background throughout that whole week leading up to their loss to the Raiders. Now, the last thing we learned in week 5 in the NFL season, it's something we bang on every single week at the end of this segment. I'm just going to keep doing it because people keep playing these horrible money line favorites. Look, I get it. It seems safe. Yes, the Chiefs seemed like a safe bet against the Las Vegas Raiders. Well, guess what? They lost outright. We saw the Dallas Cowboys nearly lose outright. We saw the Niners, huge favorites against the Miami Dolphins. They did lose. Again, big money lines. There is no value there as opposed to finding value in the spread betting market. And it's just a big mistake. Again, there are better ways to spend your money as an NFL bettor. There are better ways to put your money to use, such as, for example, following the picks on the show, which are all spreads and totals, minus 110 or something in that neighborhood. You can find value in those markets. You do not need to put down $300 to win 100 in a league where the talent is so spread out that you just don't know what's going to happen every single week in the NFL. So that's what we learned in week 5 of the NFL season. Now let's take a look at what I learned personally this past week in a segment we call Upon Further Review. Last week, our NFL picks went 2-3 on spreads and totals, bringing us down to 15, 10, and 2 for the 2020 season. Now, anytime you can say you went down in winning percentage and you're still at 60%, that's great. That's certainly something to celebrate. But we do have to look back, talk about what we learned in the week before, because we don't want to run from our losses and pretend like they didn't happen. Now, where I was wrong, first of all, started on Thursday night. Got off to a rough start to the week when we took the Tampa Bay Buccaneers minus 3.5 against the Chicago Bears. Things look great. 13-0 in favor of the Bucs. Everything falling into place until the last 5 minutes of the first half. You had a missed false start against the Bears. That was called a neutral zone infraction, moved them up 5 yards, kept a drive alive that they turned into their first touchdown of the game, did Chicago. Very next possession, missed roughing the passer. Tom Brady hit at the knees, didn't call that. Then they did correctly reverse the call on the field of a hit on a defenseless receiver against Chicago. Turned out to be a fumble on the play. Easy second touchdown for the Bears. Tampa Bay really never got far enough ahead of the number from there for it to feel like a bad beat. But again, just, some bad luck. It happens when betting the NFL, and it happened to me on Thursday Night Football. That's one spot where I was wrong. A much more convincing case of being incorrect came in the Eagles-Steelers game where I had the under 44 for the contest. That game went over 44 by the middle of the third quarter. I mean, it wasn't even close. It was a shootout. Two inept offenses coming into the week put on an offensive clinic. Claypool for the Steelers, 4 receiving touchdowns on his own. Carson Wentz developing an excellent rapport with a guy named Jared Fulgham, who I couldn't pick out of a lineup, even still after that game. Just a ton of points, nothing you can do about it. Tip your hat and move on. Finally, the Colts as a 1-point favorite against the Browns. They actually went off as a slight dog. Either way, just needed to win the game to cover the spread, and that did not happen. The second half, a calamitous comedy of errors from the Indianapolis Colts. Phillip Rivers throwing a pick 6 when the game was still pretty tight. Of course, they respond with a kickoff return for a touchdown to the Colts. Then a couple of possessions later, you have Nyheim Hines as a punt returner calling for a fair catch and catching the ball inside the 5-yard line. And what happens the very next possession? Phillip Rivers, intentional grounding in the end zone. It's a safety. And really from there, the Colts never recovered, even though it did end up being, a 9-point game or something like that at the end. Colts never really within touching distance of the victory in that game. Very disappointing stuff from a team that came into that week number 1 in the NFL in yards per play allowed. They still have that honor, but it has gone up significantly since then, as Baker Mayfield did a really nice job moving the ball in the passing game. Now, there were a couple of spots where I was right, and we'll talk about those as well. The Vikings covering the number against the Seattle Seahawks, we got it at +7. Honestly, they should have won that game outright. The first half they played against the Seattle Seahawks was art. It was incredible. Their game plan said, listen, we're going to punch him in the mouth with the run and use that to set up Kirk Cousins rather than going the other way around. And it worked to perfection. They dominated the time possession, about a 2-1 margin in that category. But just a couple of mistakes, those 2 turnovers early in the second half. And then, of course, the whole situation with should you go for it, should you not go for it on 4th down deep in Seattle territory. It's interesting because everything in your head says, yes, I should kick the field goal and go up by 8, forcing Seattle to score a touchdown. But on top of that, you have to get the 2-point conversion as well. However, the win probabilities suggest if you get that 1 yard on 4th down, you win the game because, of course, you can kneel out the clock, as opposed to giving Russ a chance to go down the field, touchdown, 2-pointer, you go to overtime, and who knows what happens at that point. Either way, covered the number, even if the end of the game was pretty bizarre for both sides. It ended up working out in our favor. Also correct about our early play from last Tuesday, the Houston Texans -6 at home against the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars, folks, are, to me, it's not even a question, the worst defense in the NFL so far this season. And Houston actually took advantage of it. It was tight in the first half, but the second half, Houston absolutely put it on the Jacksonville Jaguars, forced a couple of turnovers there in that second half. Excellent game by the ghost of Bill O'Brien, I should say, in Romeo Crennel now as the interim head coach. And of course, Deshaun Watson looking strong for the Texans at quarterback. And again, we're going to keep our eye on this. I want to see how they play against a better team coming up, because I think, in my head, I think, okay, emotional lift based off of Bill O'Brien being gone, but does it stack up against real competition as opposed to a pushover defense like the Jacksonville Jaguars? I guess, ladies and gentlemen, we will find out. And that, folks, is upon further review. Of course, to get the information that I use to make my picks, use BetQL.co. Again, over 10,000 NFL game simulations per contest. Let you know what you need to know heading into each game. They have grades on each team's offense, defense, special teams, injury updates, info on the line movements, and of course, those 10,000 simulations give you projected point totals for each team, which you can apply to the spread and totals markets as well. Use promo code Sanin on the site, get 20% off everything at BetQL.co. Now, this segment, we're going to talk about COVID-19, and we're not going to talk about it from a sports radio talk show segment kind of way where we talk about, oh, should the games happen? Should they not happen? That's not for me to decide, as Nicholas checks in and says that Houston was his lock last week. Way to go, Nick. It was mine too. I'm feeling pretty psyched about that. Let's see if they can build on it next week. Back to COVID, though. What we want to talk about is how it affects sports bettors, because that's what we're here to do. We're here to make money betting on football. When it comes to COVID-19, obviously games have already been rescheduled, and that has had an impact on a number of teams. Specifically, the Tennessee Titans have had their season shaken up dramatically. Let's talk about the Titans for a little bit. Their Game 4 game against the Bills, it's happening right now at the end of Week 5. So what you have, they were supposed to play against the Steelers in Week 4. Instead, that's been moved to Week 7 as I get my notes crossed up. And of course, they're playing the Bills tonight instead of what was supposed to be on Sunday. What you have there, in addition to a really wild situation where you have guys missing games because of the COVID, and you have a difficult time game planning because their facility's been shut down for as long as it has, what you have is a situation now where the Titans had a Week 4 bye. They have to play the rest of the season without one, unless, of course, the rumored Week 18 may pop up. But for now, they're supposed to play 13 straight regular season games to close things out. And then if they make the playoffs, again, unless they get that number 1 seed in the first round bye, they're playing right off of that as well. That could mean a fatigued team coming down the stretch. this season, something to keep an eye on as it pertains to the Titans. Now, the team they're playing tonight, the Buffalo Bills, they've had their schedule shifted around as well. Of course, again, supposed to play the Titans earlier in the week. Now they're playing it on Tuesday. That affects them in a very real way for next week. They were supposed to play the Kansas City Chiefs at home on Thursday night this week. Since you can't play on 2 days rest in the NFL, that means they're playing that game now on Monday. And cool, we get a Monday night doubleheader. That's always fun. But it also means the Bills, in a way, are kind of being punished for the whole COVID situation surrounding the Tennessee Titans. Whereas they would have had a rest advantage against the Chiefs because the Chiefs had to travel from KC to Buffalo right before a game. That doesn't exist anymore. Now, the Bills are the ones coming off of a short week with a couple days less rest than the Chiefs. Early lines suggesting the Chiefs 3-point favorites in Buffalo. And again, without a crowd and without the rest advantage, you can see why it's lined that way in favor of Kansas City. And again, you feel bad for the Bills, but from a betting perspective, the Chiefs might now have an advantage that they certainly would not have had if they had to play against Buffalo in Buffalo on Thursday night. Elsewhere, a couple more teams getting games switched around. The Broncos being impacted. Week 5 against the Patriots moved back a week. Week 6 against the Dolphins gets moved to Week 11. Then their Week 7 game against the Chargers moved to Week 10. And again, this is another team, you feel like they're getting punished because now instead of playing a Patriots team that was without Cam Newton because of COVID, well, Cam Newton's probably going to play now in their Week 6 matchup. And the Broncos did nothing wrong. They violated no protocol or anything. Nobody has tested positive for the virus in any notable way in Denver. But now they have to face a healthy Cam Newton as opposed to facing a Jarrett Stidham or a Brian Hoyer. And again, that just feels unfair. A lot of people have talked about these teams that have been impacted by COVID should have to forfeit games. And this is a situation where you feel like, wow, maybe they should, because of just how much it impacts the Denver Broncos negatively when they were the team that had nothing happen to them whatsoever as an organization. But from a betting perspective, you had a double-digit line early in the week last week for this game, and then it kind of went off the board as it became clear that it wasn't going to be played. And you would assume it's going to be around something like that again, as now Patriots off a bye, healthy Cam should be able to get the better of the Broncos there. A couple other teams impacted, Jets and Chargers, the Dolphins having some games moved around as well. And at this point, now that we've run down the betting angles, you hope that this is a situation like Major League Baseball. Baseball had a couple of teams break out, but they got it under control in a timely fashion to get the rest of the season going without missing too much action. You hope the same thing happens in the NFL. But again, for bettors, constantly keeping an eye on the COVID-19 reserve list, very important. The Titans would have been a great play tonight against the Bills team, missing Tre'Davious White, missing John Brown, if not for all the players on their COVID reserve list, made it a no play in my humble opinion. So something to keep an eye on as the season goes along. And of course, we'll keep you updated with as much information as we have in our game previews each week right here on the GBI show. Now, because you've been good and because you've sat through the show on an NFL Tuesday, second time in 70 years you've been able to say an NFL Tuesday. But because you did that, we'll give you some early action for Week 6 that you'll want to lock in before it gets later in the week and the lines start to move. Our early action for this week, the Carolina Panthers, 2.5-point favorites over the Chicago Bears. It's no secret, last week I was not high on the Bears against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And the reason for that is because the Bears might be the worst team at 4-1, and at the time they were at 3-1, in the history of the NFL. Football Outsiders has them ranked in the mid-20s in terms of their overall efficiency ratings. Carolina well above them despite having an inferior record at 3-2. They needed miracle comebacks to the Bears against the Lions and the Falcons to get here. Outside of that, again, some fortunate breaks against Tampa Bay last week, and then beating the Giants, who, again, at this point, I think Clemson could in earnest beat the Giants. I know people always shut that down. I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure if Clemson couldn't beat the Giants with how inept they are and how depleted they are all over the field. Regardless, it speaks to a team in Chicago that has been anything but impressive. 4-1 on the season, but only a plus 5-point differential. That's alarming. Carolina at 3-2 has a plus 4-point differential, and they got blown out by Tampa Bay one week. Nick Foles this season, 6 yards per attempt thus far. Only Darnold worse in that regard in terms of yards per pass attempt. Nick Foles this season, 5 touchdowns, 3 picks. Well, you look at Mitchell Trubisky, who got replaced by Nick Foles. He was averaging 6.5 yards per attempt. He had 6 touchdowns to 3 picks. Not a big upgrade at the quarterback position, even though you're talking about a quarterback who has won a Super Bowl and has kind of more positive connotations to his name in Nick Foles. Numerically, that has not borne out so far this season. Then you look at Carolina, might have Christian McCaffrey back this week, a huge boost, and not one that's going to move the line significantly, but you bring one of the best offensive weapons in the league back into an offense, I don't think it's going to make that offense worse. 3 straight wins for the Panthers after 2 poor performances on defense to start the season, right? Gave up a ton of points to the Raiders, but we just learned, they did that to the Chiefs too, did the Raiders. That's not as bad a loss as it looked in week 1. And then, of course, they lost to Tampa Bay, who, again, might have the best defense in the NFL this season. In those 3 wins for the Panthers, those 3 consecutive wins, they're giving up just under 18 points per game during that stretch. Against the Chicago team that struggles to move the ball, you can only expect that to continue. Panthers with a 0.7 net yards per play advantage, and all that coming from the offensive end. Chicago a little bit better in that regard defensively, but the Panthers averaging over a yard more per play than the Chicago Bears so far this season. And again, it bears repeating, Chicago doing that against inferior competition so far. So, again, take that for what you will, but numerically, love the Panthers in the spot. Love the boost from Christian McCaffrey, at least being in the conversation to be back in action this week. And again, Nick Foles, extremely overrated in my book to this point in the season. Chicago's 2 road games this year, they were the games against Detroit and Atlanta. In those games, trailed by 16 to the Falcons and 17 to the Lions. If they go down like that against the Panthers, they're not going to come back because the Panthers are at least respectable enough on defense and can keep the ball moving enough to avoid that sort of calamitous comeback in the fourth quarter that the Bears have benefited from in both of their times away from Soldier Field. So that is your early action for week 6. Take the Panthers minus 2.5 over the Chicago Bears before it gets to that key number of 3 or beyond. So that's the GBI show for this week. Of course, still plenty of football to watch here on a Tuesday night. Never thought you'd hear that in your whole life. But Bills-Titans heating up here on a Tuesday. Of course, no Thursday night football this week. So next week on the show, we're going to have a little bit more time to break down the rest of the games on the schedule. We usually do a pregame show for the Thursday night game for a good chunk of the show on Thursday. Instead, we'll have a little bit more room to breathe. We're still going to run quick slants, our fast previews of every game on the schedule, but we'll have some time to let them breathe a little bit. We'll be able to give you a little bit more information. I might not sound as winded throughout, so that'll be a huge plus. Either way, hope you tune in with us on Thursday. Until then, good luck with your bets. LeBron is better than Jordan, and have a good night.